In our continued trek of Switch 1 games on the Switch 2, it's a known fact that not all Switch 1 games are perfectly fixed on the new console. Bloodstained still has frame rate issues, and many games have stuttering and hiccups all over. Some optimizations and how games run, the Switch 2 simply cannot power through, especially for the really badly optimized games. Today, we're diving into a game that's like that. Improvements are here, but not for everything. Since you guys did request that I cover the rest of the Neptunia Switch games, let's dive into one of the more recent ones. Here is how I've gotten Neptunia Game Maker Revolution to run on the Nintendo Switch versus the Nintendo Switch 2. For a brief summary of the game itself, Game Revolution is a spin-off of the Neptunia series focused on the adult Neptune from Mega Dimension V2 in another world, helping girls that are actual game developers, both with game development events and bigger plot threads that pop up later on. It's a game with a mix of the sisters versus sisters combat and some sim-like elements for developing games, and mostly really just for your base of operations. It was also a bit of an oddity. Sisters vs. Sisters played pretty well on Switch, but Game Maker used the same engine and did not play well. It was filled with long load times, constant stutters and frame rate hiccups, and was all around just a playable but not smooth at all experience. Let's begin with the biggest improvement, which are load times. Game Maker on Switch 1 had long load times for basically everything. Battle, dungeons, loading a save, etc. Just about the only thing that didn't take a long time to load were cutscenes. Let's start with loading a save file. The save data I'm using is just loading into the 2D world map and not a save file into a 3D dungeon, so we can save a little bit of time. On Switch 1, it takes around 11 seconds to go from the save data menu into the 2D world map, whereas on Switch 2, it is only 4 seconds. Next is loading dungeons from that world map. The Switch 1 will load the Wetlands dungeon that has all of those rain effects in around 13 seconds total, just a bit more than loading a save file. On Switch 2, it is once again only about 4 seconds. Finally, loading a battle takes especially long on Switch 1. If you run into an enemy, you're going to get this little hold on a second stuttering while you wait 11 to 12 seconds to load in and start. And like a broken record on repeat moving on to Switch 2, the same loading sequence only takes around 4 to 5 seconds total. In other words, loading pretty much anything on Switch 2 is going to take less than half the time it does on Switch 1, which is a gigantic improvement. Now let's get to the actual gameplay and frame rate, and Switch 1 struggled a lot with this game. You do get 30 FPS a lot, but not without hiccups, stutters, and choppiness. Field navigation is a great place to start and a little bit weird. You'll see the frame rate overall at 30 FPS. But the running animations of the character models look off, providing choppy animation that makes the frame rate look a lot worse than it actually is. Battles themselves are a bit less stable than this. Once you get into the arena, the overall flow looks pretty okay. The camera does get jumpy when moving around, and the character chain attacks do have drops when those animations go through. This is consistent throughout pretty much the entire game. It was fine when it released. Not as good as it could have been, but fine, playable. What wasn't fine was the game's weird motorcycle mechanic. In any of these oddly small dungeons, you could ride on a motorcycle to make traveling much easier, or depending on what dungeon you're in, significantly harder. The early dungeons of this game were just too small for a motorcycle mechanic, not to mention that there was a lot more platforming and ladders involved than the much larger dungeons of earlier Neptunia games. But besides the game's design, the Switch 1 really struggled with this mechanic. It had a lot of frame drops and choppy animations that made it so difficult to tell where you were going you couldn't precisely aim the bike, and it made me just not even use the motorcycle feature at all unless the game forced me to. Swapping over to the Switch 2 makes it a lot better, but do remember that this game has a locked FPS cap of 30 frames per second. So unlike the East Asia Soft re-releases of the Rebirth trilogy that spike up to 60 FPS on Switch 2, this game can't go any higher than 30, just like Sisters vs. Sisters. And when we go to the field, we see our first issue. The frame rate is absolutely more stable at 30 FPS. Just looking at how environments move as you run around the area. A lot less stuttering and hiccups. However, the character animations when they're running around still look choppy. They look better, but if you look at how the arm movement is, it's still very snappy and choppy as they go. Next up are battles. Once you load in, the frame rate's very good. A stable 30 FPS even when chaining character attacks or going into those cinematic EXE drive attacks. It plays very well once you get in, at least until you finish a battle. When the final enemy is taken out, you will get a little stutter to transition into the battle results screen and a couple more seconds of stuttering when it transitions from battle and back into the dungeon. And finally is the motorcycle. It certainly looks better on Switch 2. Not as choppy and all over the place when driving through the rain-filled wetlands map, though it still feels a little jumpy when turning the camera while driving at those faster speeds. I did try it in a dungeon that didn't have the constant rain effects of the wetlands, but the camera movement feels pretty much the same. It's fine when you're going straight, but just the way the camera moves during turns just feels choppy enough to not be perfectly smooth. As a result of all of these different things, it's definitely an improvement over Switch 1, but it doesn't feel like it's by a lot. I think if this game were not hardwired and stuck with a 30 FPS cap, it would perform far better on Switch 2. The frame rate itself looks smooth, but weird ways this game was designed, like the animations for how characters go and just how the camera jumps around when you're on the motorcycle, creates weirdness that, just like on Switch 1, makes it look like it performs way worse than it actually does. It's probably the weirdest case I've encountered thus far in testing Switch 1 games on Switch 2. That's all I've got to say about performance, so here is a side-by-side comparison of the game running on both Switch 1 and Switch 2. And that is all I have for you today. I'll be back soon with more comparisons and reviews. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching and have a great day.